Welcome to Ancestral Health Today, evolutionary insights into modern health.
Welcome to Ancestral Health Today. I'm Todd Becker. Today we're going to discuss the essential role of seafood nutrition in the evolution and health of the human brain. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Crawford. In 1971, Dr. Crawford published the first evidence of the role of two essential fatty acids, DHA and ARA, which is arachidonic acid, in the evolution of the brain. This was followed by studies documenting the important role of these essential fatty acids in preventing behavioral disorders, and particularly their presence in breast milk for preventing preterm birth and neurodevelopment disorders in human infants. Dr. Crawford is visiting professor at Imperial College in London and has been director of the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition since 1990. Among his numerous honors and prizes, Michael was elected by his peers to the Hall of Fame at the Royal Society of Medicine in 2010. He's published more than 300 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 4 books, most recently, The Shrinking Brain, which documents the evolutionary evidence for the role of marine food web in human nutrition and the societal threats posed to brain nutrition and intelligence by recent changes in the food supply and the human diet. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you.
Let's start by talking about two molecules, DHA, that's docosahexaenoic acid, and ARA, which is arachidonic acid. And can you start by describing the chemical structure of those two molecules and how that plays into their electrical and signaling functions in the cell and in the brain?
That's a long story. Let's start with arachidonic acid because it's very simple. It's a 20-carbon fatty acid with some 4 mesylin-interrupted double bonds, and it's responsible for a heck of a lot of stuff. The Nobel Prize in 1982 from Bergstrom, Samuelson, and Bain was given for the discovery of the role of arachidonic acid in cell regulation, which is involved in many different aspects. For example, 99% of the time it is being converted to prostacyclin by your endothelial cells in the circulation of your blood. And that maintains the blood flow, blood pressure, and it stops irritated platelets from sticking to the wall of the endothelium and causing a thrombus. So, but it does all sorts of other things. In terms of the immune system, it stimulates the immune response, which is important if you have injury, of course. It was very much involved in the response to injury and so on. So it is the parent of this whole range of cell-regulating molecules that operate at very tiny concentrations, but are surgically acting at the specific site of requirement. Now, docosahexaenoic acid, on the other hand, is a molecule which we think was the original chromophore in that when the oxygen tension had reached a point at which air-breathing life became thermodynamically possible. This was about 600 million years ago in the Vengi. There was this explosion of not just air-breathing life, but all 32 phyla that we know today, the different shapes and sizes or forms of different animal life. It's called the Cambrian explosion. And this happened in a very short geological time span. So everything happened at a very great speed at that time, and then got a bit quieter after that. One of the key issues as to why this may have happened, of course, is because prior to the advent of oxygen, there was no ozone layer. And so the planet was bathed in intense solar radiation and the ultraviolet region. Now, docosahexaenoic acid, which is a 22-carbon fatty acid, it has 6 double bonds. That's 12 pi electrons. And each double bond is separated by a methylene, we call it methylene interruption. So electrons can't move up and down the molecule as with a conjugated double sequence of double bonds. They're stuck in their respective wells. And this turns it into a resistor. But it's only a resistor up to a certain point, because if you increase the potential difference across the membranes where it lies, you could suck out an electron. Once you suck out an electron, it can then, through a system we call tunneling, electron tunneling, it can then act as a conductor. So it's a semiconductor in a sense. Now, it absorbs in the ultraviolet. It doesn't absorb light in the visible spectrum. It absorbs in the mid-UV range. And John Sargent at Stirling University, late John Sargent, analyzed dinoflagellate. And the dinoflagellate is a sort of little single-cell system, very similar to what one would expect to have been the first air-breathing cells. It has an eye spot which can both see and photosynthesize. And this is stuffed full of docosahexaenoic acid, stuffed full of DHA. And not only stuffed full of DHA, but it has di-DHA. He described di-docosahexaenoic acid phospholipids in this dinoflagellate. Now, the extraordinary thing is that you and I have di-DHA in our own photoreceptors. So what this really tells us is that the earliest living systems were using docosahexaenoic acid in vision. That what effectively was happening was DHA was absorbing in the ultraviolet light and that would kick out electrons. And these electrons would start sort of running around the system and causing hairs to shake and do all sorts of. You put your finger in an electric plug and you get a chop. And so this would have initiated, as the system became multicellular, this would have initiated the beginning of the nervous system and ultimately through the brain.
Right, so as you say, this DHA was present in this very early single cellular organism, right? It was in the dinoflagellate. This was, 600 million years ago?
600 million years ago. Yeah.
And this is the same molecule that's dominant in our brain. It's unchanged,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. And it's been, we have DHA in our own eyeballs today. We have it in our own synapses. We have it in our neurons. This is where it's really concentrated and gave them sparked the idea that it was a signal transducer. And so it is really fundamental. If you look at the cephalopods, right at the very beginning, 450 million years ago, we have 4 dyes in the cephalopods, and the cephalopod eyes are very similar to human eyes, and they're stuffed full of DHA, and the fish, both in the eyes, the synapses, and the neurons, the brains of the fish, the amphibia, the reptiles, the mammals, the birds, and ourselves, all, without exception, use docosahexaenoic acid in the signaling systems, in vision, and in the brain.
This is such a remarkable fact that it's been so conserved from these hundreds of millions of years, and that it's the common denominator, as you say, in vision, in the eye, in nerve transduction, and in the brain. And it's essential to the functioning of our brain. And then you mentioned the other molecule, arachidonic acid, which is present in all mammalian brains, right? So in similar ratio, and it's conserved. So can you say a little bit more about how is it that these two molecules, DHA and ARA, are in similar ratios in all mammalian brains? How did that come about?
Well, it's I mean, the brain is made up of all sorts of different cells. Different cells, cell types have different compositions. But on the broad scope of things, the neurons and synapses are rich in DHA and have got arachidonic acid as well, whereas the Michel Lagarde from Lyon shows that the astrocytes are rich in arachidonic acid. And they each have two different functions. The neurons obviously are involved in thinking and thought processes and doing things. Whereas the astrocytes are involved in maintaining the myelin and are maintaining the neurons and synapses in good health. They have a foot against the blood circulation in the brain, and so they're taking the nutrients from the blood and making sure that the rest of the brain is healthy. So although there's this, in my mind, distinction between the two, the astrocytes and the neurons, it's far more complex than that, but let's just leave it at that sort of little distinction.
Yeah. So I guess this is quite interesting that if you look at all mammalian brains, you've got these two molecules, DHA, ARA, in similar ratio. So one of the big differences, though, is the size of the brain across the species. So how did what started out as a small brain, what factors lead it across the animal kingdom to get larger? What was the driving force there? And then how does that culminate in the large human or hominid brains?
Let's start with how did it shrink?
Okay.
And when you look at the brain size relative to the body size, with virtually all small mammals like rats, guinea pigs, hyraxes, and things like that. Squirrel, for example, a very bright little animal, a squirrel with quite intensive neurological function. The squirrel actually, in relation to brain size, in relation to its body, it's got a bigger brain than we have. It's about 2.5% of the body size. We're 1.9 or thereabouts. So the interesting thing is these small mammals can make DHA from the parent, which occurs in all photosynthetic systems. That's why the marine system is rich in it, because it starts with photosynthetic stuff. Whereas the land-based system, the food web has got two sides to it. It's got the seeds, and it's got our bread, if you like, and it's also got the leaves. The leaves are rich in docosahexaenoic acid, but the seeds are rich in not arachidonic acid, but it's the parent linoleic acid. Now, these little animals, like rats or hyraxes and squirrels, can make DHA quite effectively from the green stuff. Even chickens can make it from the green stuff. But as the process of making DHA is rate limited, it's a slow process. Andrew Sinclair and I showed in the early days that if you provided radioisotopically labeled DHA and its precursor from the green food, alpha-linolenic acid, with a different label, and fed the two labels through developing rat pups, the DHA was used for brain growth and construction, cumulative function, an order of magnitude more efficiently than trying to synthesize it from alpha-linolenic acid, because it's a slow process. So the problem is that as you get bigger and bigger bodies, you outstrip the ability of the animal to make DHA. It's accumulating protein, you see. And you could take a rhinoceros, for example, compared to the squirrel. And the rhinoceros gets all the protein it needs from the simplest food, namely grass. And it builds a huge body of 1 ton in 4 years. But the brain size is only 350 grams. So what in fact had happened is universally throughout the animal kingdom, the brain size has shrunk in relation to body size as the animals got bigger and bigger and bigger.
And that's certainly true, like across the herbivores. But then, as you pointed out in your book, carnivores have an advantage, right? In that they can get a source of that, the DHA from the animal that they eat, right?
Yeah, that's right. They get the lifetime's effort of an animal at one meal, kind of thing. But they still can't make a big brain. They're still, I mean, the lion's brain size is quite small, actually. It's only about, again, it's the same sort of order, about 350. But they clearly, in evidence, they have a much more sophisticated visual system to begin with, and then they have a much more sophisticated peripheral nervous system, because the legs end and arms end in articulated claws, which is quite different to the herbivores, which end in hooves, with no fingers, no claws, hooves. The whole thing is shrunk. Even the peripheral nervous system is shrunk as these animals got bigger and bigger. So that is the shrinking brain on the land-based food web. As
the herbivores get bigger, their brain size is limited. Carnivores can get some more access to it. Can't they get sufficient DHA from the livers and the brains of the animals that they eat? No, because
especially the herbivores, if you look at the chemistry, we published a lot of this starting in 1969 in the Biochemical Journal. The herbivores have got just a tiny amount of DHA in their tissues. It's mainly docosapentaenoic acid, which is the step before DHA. It's only got 5 double bonds. But so in effect, there's not a lot of DHA in these herbivores for the incorporation by carnivores. They have, universally, the carnivores have got this neurological advantage with vision and articulated claws and all that kind of stuff. So they have a pretty good extensive peripheral nervous system and a pretty good visual system, as you well know. So it's a different story, but on the whole, what has happened is that the bigger they get, the smaller the brain is in relation to body size, whether you're a carnivore or herbivore. Carnivores always have an increase in brain body weight ratio compared with the herbivores, and of course much greater, which is interesting, than the reptiles that preceded them.
Okay, so then I think where your innovative thinking has come in is in trying to explain this massive expansion in hominids, going from our early primate ancestors to this massive growth of the human brain. And so how did that happen? How is it that humans were able to grow their brain?
Well, let's start with the Great Extinction. In the period before the Great Extinction, the reptiles laid eggs. The reproductive system was an egg-laying system. Whatever happened, and they became extinct, and the great huge trees, the cycads and the ginkgos and all the rest of them, shrank and became bodslides. We had the evolution of the flowering plants. And the flowering plants had these protected seeds which contained linoleic acid. So this introduced what we call the omega-6 family of essential fatty acids for the first time in absolute abundance. And that allowed the new animal systems, which will be very small at that time, to make arachidonic acid. And so the key issue here was that arachidonic acid, with all its cell-regulating systems and its adhesion molecules and so on and so forth, would make the egg stick. to the mother. And this was quite different to the egg-laying system. The egg-laying system, the new life only got one squirt of good stuff, whereas the placental system, as it evolved, got this profusion for 9 months in the primates as they evolved. So what we now have is arachidonic acid playing a key role in the evolution of the mammals specifically.
Right, because that allowed a much longer gestation, right?
Yeah, and this in effect allowed also the huge increase in brain size, because, as you rightly pointed out, all brains are composed of both arachidonic acid and DHA. So we have this huge increase in brain size compared to the reptilian egg-laying stuff, for a start. Then set that against the evidence that all, without exception, land-based mammals, brains shrank, they grew bigger and bigger bodies. So how did early Homo sapiens escape that trap? And the reason for the escape of the trap can only have been access to the marine or the aquatic food web, where there was an abundance of DHA. So we now, for the first time in evolution's history, we had both arachidonic acid from the land-based food web, and we had DHA from the marine food web. And the two together, boom, and you have this great expansion of brain.
So let's then go to this, because there's this dominant view that humans evolved in the Rift Valley in Africa, in the savannas, and that what really drove human evolution and the increase in the brain size was hunting of large megafauna to supply the fat and the calories that allowed the brain to grow. Right? And that this was the driver. And you're saying something quite different, which is no, it didn't happen in the savannas, it happened at the shoreline. So what's the evidence for that view?
Well, the evidence for that is, as I've already discussed, the shrinking brain on the Savannah food web. And you know, the point really being is the Savannah food web provided arachidonic acid, but you had to be pretty bright anyway to go out and chase animals with spears and bows and arrows and things like that. You're already bright. The point I would like to make is very simple. The men would go off and hunt for to catch something. If they caught something, fine, that would be great. If they didn't, it wouldn't matter, because the people that really count are the women, and in particular the pregnant women. And in fact, the diet of the food web throughout the growth of the female to reproductive age. Now, when she's pregnant and perhaps have a couple of children or something like that, the men go off hunting, and she can just wander around the coast and pick up the richest food resource on the planet, or heavily pregnant, without expending much energy. And it didn't matter whether the men caught anything or not. She would be very happy with that. And it's the mothers that matter, really. The nutrition of the mother was all important, and she would undoubtedly be enjoying the fruta del mare whilst the men were off trying to do something, if that's the case.
And so what's really driving then the growth of the brain is this access to marine food, which is rich in DHA, and the mother's eating that DHA, and that's supplying the brain through the whole gestation period. Is that the idea?
Yeah. The missing factor on land-based food is DHA, but both are important. Don't get me wrong, but without the marine food web, it's not going to happen. And without the land food web base, it may, but I don't think it would happen. I mean, if you look at the dolphin, The dolphin's very interesting because it's the closest relative brain size to Homo sapiens. If you compare a dolphin's brain, for example, with a similar body-sized land-based animal, which would be a horse or a zebra. A zebra or a horse has got about 300 grams of brain. The dolphin's got 1.7 kilograms of brain. I mean, this. I mean, how? Oh well, that speaks for itself. So but the interesting thing is, if you look at the chemistry of the dolphin, it's both rich in arachidonic acid and DHA. It in its food web, it's deliberately seeking foods from the marine food web that have got arachidonic acid in it. So the importance of arachidonic acid is there, even in the marine food web. And again, with all the marine mammals, they're all very much the same, funnily enough. So it's the combination of the two that was really critically important. You can't have it one without the other.
Okay, so I think you've made a fairly strong case in terms of the biochemistry of the brain, in terms of its lipid composition and the long gestation period. But I still want to come back because you are really shooting down what's been a dominant theory of the Savannah theory. And one of the arguments that human evolution took place in the savannas and required hunting is the extinction of the megafauna. There used to be very large, mammoths and large herbivores that were essentially hunted to extinction at the very time that the human brain size from erectus was growing.
By the time they were doing that sort of stuff, they were pretty bright. The brain was already how it would have parts. You can't make bows and arrows without being pretty bright.
Your point would be that this hunting happened after the growth of the human brain.
Well, it would be, yes, it would be along. You had to be capable of quite a lot of skillful stuff to make bows and arrows that were effective, and certainly to make spears. And I don't think it matters because, as I said, that's what the men were doing. The women, on the other hand, were on the coastline. The men were running in, and these were locally defined regions anyway. So I don't think this is contravenes what we're talking about in any manner whatsoever.
Okay. So now let's talk about the increase and then the decrease in human brain size. So you've pointed out that if you go back to early Homo sapiens, we had a brain of about, 1,600 cubic centimeters, and that in recent modern humans, it's 200 or 300 cubic centimeters smaller than that. So are we less intelligent than our ancestors? And if so, and if the brain size has decreased, what drove that? Was it the advent of agriculture? What changed?
The food web, basically. That there are a lot of people who blame the start of agriculture on this. There becomes a dependence on the land food web, which at that time there would have been no problem with the marine and river food resources. They would have been extremely rich, and in fact were extremely rich until very recent time. So I don't really see a problem there at all.
Okay, so it's really since what was that, like 10,000 years ago when agriculture was really peaking? Was that the beginning of the decline of the brain size?
That I'm not the only person to believe that was the case. The interesting thing is that if you consider the evidence, that whatever you believe, and this is a question of a lot in some people's minds of a belief system, but I don't think it's just a belief system. I think the evidence of the absolute requirement for docosahexaenoic acid, and not just docosahexaenoic acid, also the trace elements like zinc, potassium, zinc, copper, manganese, and selenium especially, are again richest in the marine food web, and they're all very much dependent, very much important in brain development and protection of the brain against peroxidative damage. So iodine, again, is another good example of a trace element that is important to the brain. Iodine deficiency being the commonest cause of mental retardation. And there's still 2 billion people at risk to iodine deficiency, and they're all inland populations. I mean, we did some work in Indonesia with the government in the beginning of 1900, and 60% of the school children had Papua goiter. 60%. They had over 1,000, what was it, about 1 million severely mentally retarded children, and 800,000 persons. But they were all inland. There was none of this in the fishing villages. And so what we recommended was that they started developing kelp farming to get the iodine into the food web. And they now have one of the best and biggest kelp farms on the planet. Kelp farmers making more money than the inland farms. So iodine was absolutely essential to and the present day evidence is that the iodine deficiency is confined to inland people. So there you have it. It's not just DHA, it's also the trace elements that were critically important.
The vitamins, the minerals, iodine, it's really the whole complex. So for that reason, I guess, would you say that just taking fish oil supplements is not going to do the job? You need that full complex nutrition from seafood.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I mean, it's better than nothing. But the actual real stuff is where you want to go. But to get back to this business of when did all this start, I think what the question you have to ask is, how did the brain evolve from 340 cranial capacity, cc cranial capacity of a chimpanzee-sized brain, to the 1,700 that has been reported for Cro-Magnon in the period of 28,000 to 32,000 years ago. 1,700, the same size as a dolphin. How did that happen? And the answer, one, has to be wild food. Has to be wild food. Whatever you think, it has to be food that was wild, because nobody was producing anything. It was wild food that powered this expansion from 340 cranial capacity to 1,700 cc. We're now at 1,336 cc cranial capacity, and it's a matter of deep concern. And if you think about the modern foods that we eat from intensively produced stuff, land-based food, if you think about that, and try to think of that in comparison with what, it doesn't take a lot of imagination, what wild food would provide. It's chalk and cheese. And that's almost certainly the reason for the shrinking of the brain.
Right. So, Michael, one of the central themes of our podcast and of Ancestral Health Society is this idea of evolutionary mismatch. And by that, what I mean is that our modern diet has deviated from the optimal diet that our ancestral Homo sapiens evolved to eat for optimal health, which is this wild diet. We've now shifted to an agricultural diet, and even more recently to a processed food diet, which is quite different than that of our ancestors. So, and yet we have very similar genes. So would you say that this change in the diet has driven sort of an epigenetic set of switches that have resulted in the smaller brain? Is it really mainly an epigenetic shift?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If you look back at the 1900, the British Army had to lower the height of entry into the army from 5'3" to 5 feet to get enough people to fight the Boer War. after that was the increase in agriculture and so on and so forth that happened. What effectively happened was the average height. This was an increase in protein is attributed to the average height increased by 0.4 of an inch every decade. And we now have people 6'6" and this kind of stuff. These are all epigenetic changes, and it illustrates just how fast that we change in height, size, and disease pattern. And that's a fact. You just look at history and it's a fact.
So the epigenetics has driven body size up, but it's driven brain size down. Is that right?
That's right. As with the rhinoceros, as with all land-based mammals without exception, this is what's happening. Shrinking brain.
You actually, looking at brain size, can you see a change even over the last 50 years? I think you've referenced, even since 1950, you're seeing some changes. Is this the case?
You can ask, does it matter? Brain size matters out of that. There are lots of people who say, "Whoa, small brains are very good because they're concentrated." Well, the fact of the matter is that the University of Hartford has presented data showing that IQ has been shrinking since 1950. And there's no doubt about it that mental ill health has been escalating, which is deeply worrying. In 2005, the European Union published an audit of health costs for Europe, in which brain disorder came top of the list at 386 billion euros. Everybody said, yeah, well, this is just clever new psychiatrists coming up with new diagnostics. Well, even so, if you get brain disorders at the top of the list that have never been thought of before, you'd have thought someone would have paid attention. Anyway, the EU did it again in 2010, and it was 789 billion, gone up from 386. Now, we got Lord Morris time to ask questions in the House of Commons, and the Lord Warner at the time answered, well, we don't know the cost of mental ill health, but give them credit. They did the numbers. And Joe Nurse, who reported them, except, again, brain disorders, mental ill health, top of the list at 77 billion.
So mental illness is on the rise, IQ, there may be declines, but what's the evidence that this is not just correlated with changes in diet, but the reduction in DHA and arachidonic acid are implicated? Is there any evidence that directly implicates those two molecules?
Abundance of evidence about this in the scientific literature about the role that DHA plays in brain growth, dendritic formation, synaptic formation, deficiency causing loss of memory, causing brain dysfunctions, and so on and so forth. The laboratory shelves are just groaning with the evidence.
No, I agree, and you've published a lot on this, and I'd like to highlight your role in looking at the role of maternal health and maternal nutrition, at prenatal and infant nutrition. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the DHA and arachidonic acid content of breast milk and in the mother in getting the infant brain off to a good start?
The best evidence, which is the RSPEC study, which was studied, a longitudinal study done by Bristol University, Gene Golding and others, and Joe Hibben from the United States National Institute of Health joined them in analyzing the data. There were over 14,000 pregnancies, and they followed the children up to 8 years of age. At 8 years of age, verbal reasoning power, a whole bunch of behavioral and social scores correlated directly, including motor function, correlated directly was the amount of fish and seafood that the mother had eaten during pregnancy. That's at 8 years in the child at 8 years. And people who were below the recommendation that they and followed the advice given by the FDA in the United States of limiting fish and seafood consumption during pregnancy, they have the worst outcomes. And in fact, the papers in the Lancet in 2007, first of many papers, and in the paper they say that it's recommendations to limit fish and seafood because of false suggestion of mercury toxicity would do harm. And there's absolutely straight line function. And this is absolutely superb evidence for our question.
Yeah, and you pointed out that the growth of the brain during pregnancy is really driven by all the energetics are driven by the formation of the brain from the maternal sources, and the DHA and arachidonic acid are critical, especially in that period of pregnancy, right? So, but what about after birth? What about early childhood? Does this nutrition continue to lead to be important in brain development? And then past childhood, is there a continued need for DHA and AHA as we get into adulthood and even into our senior years?
Well, obviously, breast milk is going to be superior to anything else. I don't think there's any question about that. But it's important. I don't understand why the companies have just focused on making substitutes for breast milk instead of saying we need to feed the mother to feed the child. Because breast milk is full of so many different hormones and all sorts of things like this, and the trace elements and stuff, even fatty acids that are not present in with can't be present in formula, for example. So I just don't understand this whole concept of I guess it's arisen because it liberates the mother and able to do work. But there you go. I don't know. I'm not a woman, so I'm not aware of the case. But there's no doubt about it. The brain continues to particularly make connections from one place to another during infancy and into childhood, and it's still going to require support from the food web for both its growth and its maintenance. I mean, the brain is very unique in the sense that it doesn't like being interfered with, and it recycles everything. But no recycling process is 100% efficient, as you well know. So, in effect, you need a constant supply, drip, if you like, to maintain this recycling process that goes on.
Okay, so we need to continuously replenish the lipids in our brain, even through adulthood. It's not. There's this idea that the brain is somehow fully formed, by adulthood, but that's not the case. It's constantly being rejuvenated. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, the point about the early developmental process is that during prenatal development, anything that goes wrong there is permanent. It's lifelong. And the low birth weight and preterm birth and maternal malnutrition during this period sentences the child to a lifetime of disabilities. So it's terribly important to get it right at the beginning, and that includes maternal nutrition prior to conception, because when a woman comes to the hospital for pregnancy care, for example, it's usually about 12 weeks after conception, by which time the cells that are forming the cortex of the brain are already doing so. So that period between conception, when they come to the hospital, to the experts for for pregnancy care is a huge amount of neurodevelopment, neurogenesis taking place already. So the importance of maternal nutrition and health prior to conception is fundamentally important. And it's more important than what happens during the pregnancy.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So let's go now into the nutritional requirements that humans should have to maintain good mental health into adulthood. How much DHA and arachidonic acid should we have in our diet, on a daily basis? What's kind of the requirement that you think we need?
No idea. WHO and FEO, and I was on the expert committee cited, reckons that you need just 250 milligrams of DHA and EPA during pregnancy per day, which is that's what they recommend. But I hate the recommendations. I like people to think about the importance of natural food. It was an importance of those wild foods which powered the evolution of our brain from 340 grams right up to 1,700. And our people, when they start thinking about that, will then make their own decisions about what they should be eating.
Okay, so then let's talk about which fish and shellfish you think are particularly rich in these, not just the essential fatty acids, but the iodine and the important minerals. Is it all fish? Is it all seafood?
The shellfish, they are especially rich in trace elements. Mussels are quite cheap. Oysters are very rich as well. I mean, the whole bang shooting match, so a lot of them, they're all rich, and there's no question about that. And the mussels are quite cheap. Oysters nowadays are expensive. But you go back to 1900, what we were talking about earlier. The barman in the East End of London used to go down to the Thames with their buckets and fill them with oysters and put oysters on the bar free for people to walk the beer. But that changed. It's changed.
Great. And just a personal question, which shellfish and fish do you personally like to eat each week?
I suspect what people did in the past is to just eat variety. Variety is the spice of life.
You've talked a lot about wild fish and wild seafood. You see, a lot of debates about the farmed fish versus wild-caught fish. There's a lot of arguments saying that we shouldn't eat farmed fish, and yet there's a big economic difference for the average person. So what is your view? What's your view on that? Is it bad to eat farmed fish, or
No, it's not bad to eat farmed fish. They're by and large, they're pretty good. But they've been losing out on DHA, the presence of DHA, having to feed them on chickens and vegetable oils from the land, which is not a good idea. But they're better than nothing. They keep you away from a lot of other nasty stuff. Anyway, we really need to think a little bit about what happened 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, people said this hunting and gathering stuff is for the birds. We're not really doing very well. We've got to do something new. So 10,000 years ago, they were bright enough to invent agriculture, animal husbandry. We're going to do this for the seed now. The foresight came out very clear statement a few years ago. The report to government, 400 scientists, that there's no more land available for committing to arable use. In fact, arable land use was shrinking because of urbanization. And we've got to do something new. They never thought about the oceans, but the oceans cover 71% of the planet is covered in water. And we've now got to start thinking about the same thing they thought 10,000 years ago with regard to coastal resources and start farming the sea. Japanese are doing it, Koreans are doing it, a whole bunch of other people are doing it. And in islands like the UK, for heaven's sakes, I mean, we've got rich waters, still rich waters, but sadly the fishing fleets have been declining, and I think it's time we started husbanding the marine resources. The Japanese have been doing it now since 1991 or thereabouts.
Yeah, you talk in your book, Michael, about the work that has happened in Okayama, Japan, with Dr. Takahiro Tanaka, to actually create an artificial reef. And can you say a little bit about that? How does that work, and how successful has that been?
Well, it's extremely successful. They first of all, on land we developed pastures for our cows and sheep, and Dr. Takahiro Tanaka had developed pastures in the sea, where the seabed had been ruined by trawlers and things like that. He planted seagrass. And this is wonderful because it not only provides food for the herbivorous species, it also provides a haven for the fry to hide from the carnivores. So that's the one thing. And so the planting marine pastures was the first thing they did. The second thing was to plant artificial reefs, because what the marine food web does is to grow on things. And if it doesn't have surfaces to grow, there's nothing to grow on. But artificial reefs provide surfaces for marine flora to flourish. And they designed, they had 7 target species, and they studied the ecology, the behavior, the behavior and the reproductive cycles and so on of these 7 target species. And so they designed the artificial reefs consistent with the ecological behavior of these different species. There's one of them that, for example, like to disappear into holes and things like that. So where this was breeding, they planted artificial reefs full of holes. They've been immensely successful. I suggested this to the government of Oman a few years ago when I was a member of their research advisory council. And they planted 360 hectares of artificial reefs, and they sent me a video of how fast they've been clothed. This was 2 years after planting. They were almost fully clothed in marine flora, and you could see all the little fish running around these artificial reefs.
Has this caught on in the UK and in the United States as well, too? Some of this
there are various people doing things like this. Yes, there are various people, but they're all in a small way. We really need this stuff being done on a large scale to regenerate the fishing communities, which is what Tanaka has done, because he's employed all the people who were previously involved in the fishing community to create this. And of course, he's still capturing the fish, so he needs the expertise of people that were involved. And the Indonesian things I refer to, the planting of kelp, for argument's sake. Kelp forests provide food. They provide fertilizer to replace all the trace elements and various things in land-based agriculture. And they capture CO2. They're the same as the rainforest. They're like rainforests, but in the sea. And they will contribute to help with containing global warming and ocean acidification. And not only that, they make the environment healthier for the production of things like oysters and mussels and so on and so forth, and all the different marine.
Yeah, this is a great theme of your book, which I highly recommend to everybody, and that is that developing marine agriculture solves the mental health crisis by regenerative seafoods, but it also fixes a lot of carbon, right? So and the oceans are there's much more space to grow food there than there is on the surface of the land too, right? So it's a huge untapped possibility, and I'm so excited that you've been promoting this, Michael.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So in sort of remaining minutes, I'm impressed that you're continuing to be active, both in your research and advocacy. What is your sort of present activity in this area? Where can people follow your work?
Well, PubMed Medline. We publish in peer-reviewed literature. We've got a recent paper in a journal called Entropy, which explains some of what I've been talking about, the role of docosahexaenoic acid in visual transduction. So this is where we're publishing stuff, apart from the Shrinking Brain, which was the book, which was an attempt to draw attention to the public and governments about the crisis that we're facing. It is really serious. This diminishing mental health can only end in dehumanization and can only end in disaster. And that is logical, and we've got to address the issue. The Children's Society just recently referred to the fact that referrals for mental ill health amongst children had risen threefold in the last 3 years. This is scary. This is really frightening. And I'm worried about the future of our children and their children in particular. And I now have 2 grandchildren. So I'm really concerned about the whole thing. It's this fate of our children that's at stake. And we've really got to get to grips with this. As I said in the 2005, 2007, 2010, 2013, 5 audits of health costs put brain disorders at the top of the list. It's unacceptable that people have not been paying attention to this. It's totally unacceptable. And it's irresponsible because it is the fate of our children and their children that's at stake.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for all of the work that you've done, first on the basic science to identify the roles of DHA and arachidonic acid and all of the associated marine-based nutrients in human evolution and human brain health, and for your role as an activist, both in helping with women's maternal health and the health of infants, and also looking at solutions, global solutions to this. Greatly appreciate it and have enjoyed speaking with you today about this, and I hope our listeners will check out your book, and if interested, get into the research behind it.
Thank you, Todd. That was very kind.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Ancestral Health Today. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on how evolutionary insights can inform modern health practices. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast to catch future episodes.